Now we move on to intelligence. And when we talk about somebody being intelligent, we often mean a collection of things. And so I just jotted down some ideas over here on my little sticky note of the sorts of things that we might be referring to when we say that somebody's intelligent. Quite often what we're talking about is that they have a good amount of general knowledge or they have a good memory. But something else might be that they are really good at solving problems, or they can be flexible and creative in their thinking. Another thing might just be that they're really quick at doing something. They just seem mentally far more efficient at getting things done. So all of these end up being components of the classic intelligence tests that are given to students and to adults alike. So right here I have a picture to just represent the different sample parts of the primary IQ test, which is known as the WAIS, Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. And so I want you to just notice that there are a number of areas where it does test general knowledge, general information, vocabulary, comprehension, this issue right here about picture completion. So all of these tap into our general knowledge. We also see areas like arithmetic reasoning, similarities. They test mental flexibility. Digit span right here taps into memory. We see that there are tests that are both verbal as well as spatial. And then this final one down here actually tests processing speed, how quickly you can do stuff. And so this is really straightforward. Everywhere you see a 1, you have to put in a triangle. Everywhere you see a 5, you put in that diamond. And there are different strategies that you can use to be more or less efficient when you're doing this task. So it does tap into how quickly you can accomplish something. Now most intelligence tests and most classes that we take tap into what has been referred to as analytical intelligence. And so this chart right here gives us 3 different forms of intelligence, 2 of which aren't really tapped into or aren't tested by most tests out there or most courses, and yet they probably have a lot more to do with general success in life than our ability to analyze actually does. And so these 3 forms of intelligence were defined by Sternberg, so this is his triarchic theory. And so he emphasizes that even though most courses focus on analytical intelligence, that it's also important for us to have what we often call street smarts or practical intelligence, as well as creative intelligence. So many of our really successful business people, our entrepreneurs, our inventors, they all really excel in these bottom 2 and may very well have done poorly in school because school really just focuses on this right here. Another aspect of intelligence that isn't assessed by classic intelligence tests but actually has a big factor in our overall life success is something known as emotional intelligence. So our ability to control our emotions, to control the emotions of other people, to regulate our behaviors and our impulses, this is emotional intelligence. And there was a really interesting little study done a number of years back, and it's commonly referred to as the marshmallow test. And I encourage you to just Google on YouTube marshmallow test. There's some videos that are really only about 3 or 4 minutes. But the way they worked is they looked at 3 and 4-year-old children, and they gave them a marshmallow. And the child was alone in a really dull, simple room with a table, and they were told that they had to stay in their chair and sit at the table. And if they were able to do that for 15 minutes without eating the one marshmallow, they would get a second marshmallow at the end. And what the researchers were interested in was who would eat the marshmallow and who wouldn't. Then what they were really interested in is, would that simple little test have any predictive value for the kids as they grew up? And it turns out that they did. The kids who refrained from eating the marshmallow, who sat at the table and refrained from eating it, they controlled those impulses, they later in life had a lot more success. They had better grades, they had better SATs, they had better job success, they were happier. So here you can see the rest of my list. They actually had better health. Even though this emotional intelligence it doesn't associate with cognitive ability, we still see that people who are high in emotional intelligence are far more successful in life than those who aren't. And in some of the videos, it also gives some advice on how to increase emotional intelligence in our children. And a big part of that is to establish boundaries and to be really consistent with those boundaries and teach our children that if they do follow the rules, there will be later rewards and later positive consequences. Okay, so I'm kind of shifting gears a little abruptly here, but what I wanted to do was to just take a minute to think about how intelligence and how cognitive ability actually varies based upon our culture. And I came across a really interesting study that was done by a researcher out of Hong Kong who I believe works in Chicago. And what he did is he asked elementary school children to draw a picture of their home. And I think it's pretty easy if we look at these two pictures to identify which one was drawn by children in the U.S. In fact, most of us have probably drawn this picture right here. Now, I want you to think about what sorts of differences exist between these two pictures. I mean, one big thing that strikes me is that this one has far more dimensionality to it. It's done in 3D. It also includes a lot more context in the background. You have mountains, you have the sunrise, you have a road going pretty far in the background. Another big thing is that over here in the American picture, we see that the child has represented him or herself as being very, very important. However, if we look over here, there is no individual identity. We see groups of people, but no individuals. And so these little components that we see just in children's drawings are actually very indicative of some big cognitive differences between people who live in the West, like in the US, and people who live in the East, like in Hong Kong, China, Japan, Korea, and actually in some Latin American countries. Those who live in the West, Americans, they tend to exhibit what's known as field independence, meaning that people are really focused on individual details, and we tend to ignore the background, we ignore the background context, and consequently, we have very good inhibition. We're very good at ignoring what we see as being irrelevant. And we're very good at picking things apart into their fundamental details, and that's the analytical thinking ability. In fact, Westerners have stronger levels of inhibition than do Easterners. I think the studies have been done particularly with people who are Chinese. And this is thought to be because Easterners exhibit what's been called field dependence. And what that means is that you have to look at the background, the field in the background, the context, in order to understand what's going on in the foreground. So if we go back to that picture right here, what we see is a lot of representation of the background context, and each individual has no meaning unless we consider the background. Now, when we are dealing with people who do exhibit field dependence, we see that they have lower levels of inhibition. They don't want to inhibit the background. It's necessary in order to understand what's going on in the front. So this is just a really short summary of about 10 or 15 years of accumulated research that has led us to understand that one's culture has a big impact on our cognitive style and actually some aspects of our intelligence as well. All right, now on this next slide, I want to bring in a number of other factors that can contribute to variations in intelligence. And one of the things that we do know is that genes contributes about 40 to 60% of the variability that we see in the intelligence in a population. But genes are certainly not the only thing, and that's really what I want to emphasize. There are a huge number of other factors that influence intelligence. So one of the big ones is socioeconomic status, and that's usually measured by the amount of money that a family earns, as well as the highest level of education that the adults in the family have attained. And what we see is that those of lower socioeconomic status do tend to have lower IQs, and this is probably related to a number of factors. This would include the number and types of resources that are available. This would be both in the home, as well as in the school and the community. We see that school quality is going to vary. I think everybody knows that. Definitely parental support varies as we get higher socioeconomic status. Parents have higher education, and therefore they have an interest and ability in supporting their children educationally and in their intellectual development. We see that there are some differences in mental stimulation. So when children are encouraged to go outside and explore and to play and try new things, to play games, to interact with adults, to read, all of those forms of mental stimulation are going to lead to an increase in intelligence. And a final thing that is tremendously important, but we often forget about, is nutrition. So nutrition is another thing that will vary based upon socioeconomic status. And we have shown that improving nutrition in a child does actually boost their intelligence. But another thing to bear in mind is that if I am in the womb of my mother, and my mother is poor, and she's malnourished or she's eating a poor diet, I'm not going to get the proper nutrients for my brain development, and that's going to lower my intellectual potential. In addition to socioeconomic status, we also see that a person's cultural identity can influence their intelligence and more definitely their academic achievement. And one of the things that we see is that among black children, especially urban black children, when they do perform well in school, they get penalized by their peers and often by their family members as well for acting white. So educational achievement is seen as a violation of one's cultural identity, and that's definitely punished. And we also see that stereotypes and expectations will influence a person's intelligence, and that's actually what I want to talk about on the final two slides. And this brings me to the topic of stereotype threat, which I think is one of the most interesting findings in the field of social psychology, and that is when we have a stereotype, it can actually impair our performance. So one of the original studies demonstrated that among black children, if they had their racial identity highlighted to them, maybe they were the one black child sitting amongst white, it wasn't actually done with children, it was done with college students, sitting among white peers, or if on their test they had to circle that they were black. We often have to do these demographic sorts of questionnaires. Just that slight little bit of activating their racial identity would actually impair their performance. And it was thought that the stereotype of blacks not being as smart as whites is a pretty pervasive stereotype. And that when you activate one's racial identity, you also activate stereotypes that are associated with it. And this appears to maybe create anxiety or some other type of threat or added pressure that actually hurt the black students' performance. We see a similar thing among white males. If they are among Asian males and they're doing a math test, if you highlight their whiteness to them, that activates the Asians are better at math stereotype, and we see that the men perform more poorly. Conversely, we see that for women, even though women have a stereotype of being poor at math, if an Asian woman has her ethnicity highlighted for her, she will do better than will white women on the test. And we really only see that difference when the racial identity is highlighted. So let's move on to the final slide. And here I want to emphasize the role of expectations in self-fulfilling prophecy. So in the study that was described here, teachers were arbitrarily told that some students were going to be better performers than others. Again, there was no difference in the students in actuality, it was just a difference in what the teachers were told. And what was determined was that at the end of the year, those kids who were supposedly arbitrarily determined as being better performers did actually show a much better level of performance. So they started off equal to the other group, but at the end of the year they were outperforming the other group. And this demonstrates how powerful teachers' expectations can really be. Most likely, the teachers who were told that they had the high performers probably spent a lot more time with those kids. They had higher expectations for those kids. They made more demands. They did deeper explanations. And those higher expectations led to a greater level of performance and a big boost in that those kids' IQs. So expectations can have a really powerful impact on our overall performance. And that does it for this video.